So in today's video, we're going to be doing quite a few different things, but one of the major things is we're going to be using a product called Terraform, which is something used a lot, I feel like, as a DevOps engineer, and for that matter, for a lot of stuff. But generally, it's used to build out infrastructure as code, right? So if you see the term IAC, infrastructure as code, a lot, they're referring to Terraform or other, competing products, basically. So either way, we're going to be using Terraform to build out a Kubernetes cluster. And so Kubernetes is a orchestration engine basically for containers. It's open source. It automates deployments and scaling and things of that nature. We'll go into deeper dives later as far as some of this stuff, but I just kind of want to show how you can not only like in our last video with the chatbot, you can build a Kubernetes environment locally and test your bot, but you could also theoretically deploy it to the cloud securely so that other people could interact with it right over the internet. So like I mentioned, Terraform, right? It's the infrastructure to deploy infrastructure. You basically there's a concept of doing a Terraform init to initialize everything, and then a plan to actually tell you what it's going to do. And then after you're happy with the output from the plan, then you would do a Terraform Apply, and that actually applies the code. So we're going to go through some of that as well. So basically, when it's all said and done, you're going to end up having, if you choose to follow the whole thing, you're going to end up having your own domain pointing to a GitHub's pages set up. And then on here, we're going to have a chat bot that we can actually talk to that'll be running in a Kubernetes pod hosted on our Kubernetes cluster exposed through an NGINX Ingress. Right? So few housekeeping things just to kind of talk about. In case you're curious, I am running on Windows right now because I only have a Windows gaming computer. I typically run on a Mac for my day-to-day stuff for work. So I tend to use the WSL with Ubuntu because it's the closest thing I can get to how I work on a Mac with ZSH and a lot of the same commands. So basically, I ran through this guide, which I'll post in the description, to install Ubuntu on Windows 10. So you go through all of that, right? And then I'm using the Windows Terminal program. That's what's going to look like this when we start working. And then I'm also using a product along with that called Oh My ZSH that allows like an enhanced CLI experience inside of the terminal, right? So I'll post links to all of this. But so that being said, this is kind of a little bit of a takeaway off of the other video. So we had a chatbot auto versioning video where we created a very basic Rasa chatbot using their initial demo bot and versioned it and created a release out on GitHub, right? So we're going to be actually using this same release model and everything and pointing that into our new setup so that we can deploy that to our Kubernetes cluster. So that being said, the first thing that you have to do is you go to this repo. We'll have a link to this in the description as well, but this is a Cookiecutter repo that'll basically have all of the variables and all of the stuff that we need to get started and to get this all deployed. So the biggest thing is you just have to have Cookiecutter installed. So if you go here and open this link, there's some install instructions. Typically you can just install it with pip if you already have Python installed, which you're going to need Python anyway for some of the docs and stuff, which you'll see in a few minutes after we get this pulled down. But basically we're going to end up running this command in just a few minutes, so we'll go ahead and copy that. But the biggest thing is we have to kind of pay attention to these bars because it's going to ask us for this information when we go and run this command, and we need to know what to put here, right? So the first thing is the project name, and so this you can kind of leave the default as Linode TF LKE. You can change that if you want, but this will basically end up becoming the folder that it creates and puts everything in. Can also be basically the name of the GitHub repo that you're going to put everything in if you decide to take it and put it up in GitHub. The other part is the TF Cloud. So we're using Terraform Cloud for this to manage our state and everything. And so there will be a link to this in the description as well, and I'll also update this README that we're looking at. But if you go here, you can see that we get state management for free. So you're going to want to click, try for free. I think you could sign in or sign up with your GitHub or your Google account or whatever. And so once you do that, it'll bring you here. I have more than one org, so in this case we're just going to create a new one for B to the Rye because I've bought a domain called btotherye.com that we're going to use for this. So once that's all set up, you should have a organization called whatever you decide to call it, and then like an empty workspace. And so that organization name is what you're going to put for this value here. The Kate's name is just basically what we're using for labeling and what we're going to name the Kubernetes cluster and such. So you could just name this whatever you want to name it accordingly. The GitHub username is being used for the GitHub pages part. So you want this to just match whatever your GitHub username is. In my case, it's going to be B to the Rye because that's my GitHub username. And then the way the GitHub page alias works, this is creating a records to what your GitHub pages that we're going to set up in a few minutes is. So this is typically going to be your GitHub username.github.io basically, right? So in my case, it's going to be btotherye.github.io, right? There's also a link here that kind of you can go through that mentions some of these things as well. We're also going to build these docs locally. So there's information here about the initial setup and some of that stuff if you need it. But we're also just going to build these docs locally to show how that works. So without further ado, we're going to copy this command. Let me get into the right folder. You won't see that, but I have, just because I've been working with this before. So we're going to keep the project name the same, so we can just hit enter. This is going to be B to the Rye. My Kate's name, we're just going to call it B to the Rye demo. And like I said, I went out and bought a name. You can buy a domain from Namecheap or whatever. If you have an already existing domain that you're not really doing anything with, you can utilize that. Basically, after you buy the domain, you'll go out, and the documentation here in a minute that we're going to generate will tell you this, but you go out to wherever your registrar is or whoever you bought the domain from, and you change the name servers to the Linode name servers, and then all of your DNS records and everything at that point, once we do the Terraform steps, will be managed by Linode. So then you can do all your configuration as code and so forth in Linode for your A records and C names and so forth, right? So I'm going to put btotherye.com there. Like I mentioned, my username, btotherye, and my GitHub pages alias, because the way that it works, it's going to be my username.github.io, right? So now I should have a Linode TF LKE directory, so we're going to open that. I'm using Visual Studio Code as well, along with, like I said, ZSH is what's giving me the colors and the stuff that you see changing. But I'm going to open this in Visual Studio Code, and you'll see there's a few sections here, right? So when it opens up, it'll just be like this. It won't have everything open. So you can go to the README, right? And there, this is what I was talking about. It mentions, right, setting up the name servers here. There's just some general information here on what the folders and such are doing. But the big thing we want to do is we want to follow the docs here, right? So the docs mention, and you can also click here to see this in a preview view, right? But the docs are mentioning, I said here's the the kind of public ones that it generates, but you're gonna not have all of the vars and stuff set up correctly in that online version, but you do now because we answered the questions and it generated the documents and stuff too. So basically, we already have Python installed. So in my case, right, if I do Python 3 version, you can see I've already got Python 3 installed. So we can follow the instructions here and do Python 3 .m bnb bnb. And then now we want to source that to activate the virtual environment. You'll see with the way my CLI is set up, it actually tells me over here, right, that I'm activated now in the virtual environment. I'll just expand this a little too so it's easier to see. And then now there's a requirements file in the docs directory. Whoops. Here. And so you'll see that, right, it's got a few things that we need to install for the docs to work. So we can just now follow what that README said and do a pip install -r docs requirements.txt. This is going to install all of the requirements that we need to build our docs locally, basically. If you see this error, it's okay, it's not a big deal. And then now we can cd into the docs directory, and like this mentions, we can now run make HTML and it'll build our docs. And so now it says, right, the HTML pages are in build HTML, like what it does here. And then so now if we go into build HTML, we can open, so we can say reveal and explore, and then I just right click, open with Chrome, right? I'm going to move this over here. And now you can see we have the docs, right? So for the rest of this guide, we're just going to follow these instructions because they're catered specifically to you and and the code and what you selected now in the instructions. So we're going to close that. We can close out of the docs now. And we're going to cd back out of the docs. So now let's hit next, and you can see, this initial setup talks about, what this is going to build out. So it's going to build out a Kubernetes cluster with 3 shared nodes. So the way this is working, you can either do shared or dedicated nodes. With Linode, the shared nodes are obviously cheaper because the backend servers that those are running on are shared among other people, so they can get, they might be slower or what have you, but it's okay for like our little demo that we're doing. It makes it cheaper too, so at that point the nodes only end up being about $10 a month per node, so $30 versus if you want a dedicated setup, I think they're about $30 a node, so you're looking at about now $90 a month. And then there's also, you need a node balancer to basically host the app publicly outside of the Kubernetes cluster. And so this is basically an NGINX pod that runs inside of the cluster that's working through a node balancer in Linode to publicly expose it and to set up the routing so that when you go to rasa.btotherai.com, it actually routes it to the pod that we're going to create inside of the Kubernetes cluster. And then, like I mentioned, it's going to set up some of the custom domain stuff in Linode and everything, right, that we need for that to work. So, as mentioned before in the chatbot auto versioning, this repo is also using conventional commits and Comitizen and has auto versioning and stuff. If you want to go ahead and use that, it's already basically built out. So you can see there's a CZ toml file with all of the versioning and stuff kind of already pre-configured for you. And then, like I mentioned, for the custom domain part, you're going to want to go out and change your name servers to these name servers, so that way their new domain will point to Linode and everything that we're going to build out will work correctly, right? As before, you're going to want to go and make sure you have Terraform installed so that you're going to be able to run the Terraform commands, right? So you should be able to run Terraform help and get output, so you can follow the instructions there. As I mentioned, right, we need that Terraform cloud, so you can go out, sign up for a free account. After you do that, we do need to go out and set up a token, right? So we're going to go out and do this real quick. So I'm going to show you this whole part on screen and everything like that when it gets to that point. Normally you would not want people to know about this token. You would hide it. You wouldn't really share it with anybody and that sort of thing. I'm going to show it to you because this is a demo and I'm going to delete all of the tokens and the whole space and everything when we're all done. But just as a general heads up, this token is a sensitive, item, and you don't typically want to share that with anybody, and you don't want to put it in version control or anything like that, right? So we'll do that in a few minutes when we get to the LKE part, but just keep that page open and remember that. I think I also linked to it in the next part too when we get to there. The last piece is the GitHub pages, right? So we need to create an initial GitHub pages so that we can then point that to our new domain eventually, and then that way when you go to www.ourdomain.com, it'll show our GitHub pages, which will be in code, and I'll show you how all that works. And then on top of that, we can have in our index.html, we can inject a script code to put a widget on there to where we can talk to the bot that's running in Kubernetes, right? Like that's the goal of the end of this project, right? So that being said, you can click on this and open in a new tab, and it'll automatically basically clone off of this starter page. So like before, for this to work correctly in the way that GitHub Pages works, you want this to be your username.github.io for the repository name, right? So I already created it earlier because I was demoing this, so we're gonna just delete that real quick. Right, so you can see I've already got it out here, so I'm just gonna go and delete this. Okay. And then now we're going to rerun through this again. So we're going to re-click this. We're going to put, remember, b to the ri .github.io, right? Click the button. All this is doing is going from this repo and creating like a fork of it basically for us to use. And then, so now you can see we have kind of a generic page here. If we go to actions, you'll see that it's starting to build out the pages already, because if we go to settings and if you go to pages, you can see like by default, because of how we set that, it's already set up, right, to create the pages and everything off of the master branch. When we're done with all of the DNS and everything, we'll come in and put our DNS stuff in here and save it. We'll put our domain and everything and save it, and then that will switch it over to also showing on our regular, www.btotheri.com when we get done with it, right? So that being said, you can go to the actions and watch this until it's done. So you can see right now it's about to deploy it. Shouldn't take very long. It's a pretty generic page and site, right? And so now you can see, hey, this is available at btotheri.github.io, right? So if I go here, now we can see our generic setup, right? So that's good. So we're going to leave that. We'll leave that for now, and we'll come back here. So now the last piece is you need kubectl installed. So kubectl is a command that we're going to use to kind of manage the Kubernetes cluster. You want to go ahead and get that installed before we start on the next step, just so that you can run some of the verification steps and everything and verify that everything's working correctly. So in order to do that, you can click on any one of these links depending on what you're doing. So for me, because I'm using WSL and my thing is Linux, I would click on Linux and follow the instructions. For example, it's a pretty straightforward process with Linux. You just curl it, right? And it will take care of everything for you, and then you can validate everything is correct, right? So once that's all done, you then should be able to run the kubectl command, right? And get output. Yeah, right. So now we can get the output. So that we have everything set up, we can now go to the next stage and go ahead and start getting stuff configured, right? So now the first thing we want to do is cd to the LKE directory, because that's where this section is, and it even tells you, right, hey, cd to the LKE directory, right? As I mentioned before, we're going to need a Linode API token. So one of the things with this also is you need to go out to Linode and sign up for an account. So if you go to linode.com You can either sign up with Google, GitHub, or whatever. After you sign up and everything and log in, you'll be presented, you know, kind of with a page like this, right? And you can see this is my existing demo DevOps with Brian cluster that I built out that I'm playing around with, right? So we haven't built a new one yet. So now basically we can go ahead though and start setting up the rest of the stuff that we need, right, for this to all work, right? So the first thing it mentions though is after we sign up for Linode, we need to follow this guide and basically create an API token, right? So if we open this, and I'm going to drop it over here so that we can do it together kind of thing. So if we follow this guide, right, we need to go into Cloud Manager, which is where we log in. After we log in, we need to go to our profile. We need to go to API tokens, right? And then we need to add one, right? So we're going to create a token, and this one I'm just going to call it V to the Y video demo, right? And then you'll notice that in the document here, I tell you the things that we need to give it to. So it needs domains read and write. So we're going to give it domains read and write. I'm going to give it none to everything right first. And so domains read and write. Kubernetes read and write, because we wanted to be able to create the Kubernetes cluster. Then it needs IPs read and write, because we have to manage some of that stuff. And then it needs Linodes read and write. So Linodes read and write. So we can then, and you can set the expiration 6 months, whatever, you know, never. I would recommend expiring these and replacing them. Do in a month, right? So we create the token. Like I said before, you normally would not give this token out to anyone. We're going to delete it at the end of the video and this whole stack, so it doesn't matter. But just as a general rule of thumb, this is the keys to the kingdom. You want to kind of keep this secret, right? So we're going to come out here and create a new thing and drop it in for now, right? Just so I have it. So after you have that saved somewhere, say I have saved my keys, right? And now this is going to be in the next step. This is going to become our TF-var token that we're going to need in Terraform, right? So I'm going to close this page out now because we're done with it. So what it's referring to is in the LKE directory, the way Terraform works is you supply variables, and it uses these variables to basically build out the code, infrastructure, whatever it is you're trying to do with it. So in this case, Linode requires a token in order to work. I don't want to put that token in what's typically a TF-var file. Like typically you can version control this. You can keep it per version. So like this could be called like prod, you know, prod vars, TF-vars, or whatever, right? Dev, so forth. You can have different ones. You can apply different, you know, stages, dev, prod, whatever, based on the information that you have in here, right? But I don't want that token in version control. And so a way that you can get around that is you still supply the variable in here just like all of the other ones, but you can export it, right, as a TF_var and then whatever your var is. So on the CLI now, we can go and we can basically follow the instructions here. Like it says export TF, so we're going to do export TF_var_ token, right, equals, and we're going to put in that value that we just created, right? And so now if we read through the rest of this, right, it mentions all the other vars are not sensitive and we can just modify them correctly, and it tells you, right, what each of them are. So and they're all coming from here, but it's referring to the vars in here, right? So the label is what we want to call it, and you can see because we were using Cookiecutter, this should be already customized to you based off of whatever label that you gave it when we were using Cookiecutter, right? Kubernetes version as of, you know, this time 1.23 was the latest stable version, but this is the version of Kubernetes that it's going to deploy. This is the region that it's going to deploy into, right? And then the pools, basically, this is a list, and for a list can be a list of pools. We're only going to create one for the demo, and we're going to tell it in that pool, I want to use this type of compute, basically, and then I want 3 of them. And that's all kind of coming from here. It's a JSON output. You can copy this and then format it to see it better. But if you look in here, we can find the one that we're using. And we can see that it's a 2 gig Linode priced at $10 a month, right? Like we had before. So that's how that works, right? So we've got all of this set. You really shouldn't have to change any of this. You can leave all of this to the default. And the biggest thing is that we just had to export that TF-var token, right? As I mentioned, this is going to create a setup with 2 gig Linodes, 1 vCPU, 3 of them, $10 a node, plus the $10 a month for the load balancer. So that's where the $40 a month comes from, right? So the other piece too that we had already kind of talked about is remember we had to set up that Terraform cloud, right, for the state. So we need to go out to HashiCorp and sign up and everything. Once you do, like before, you'll have this area. It'll just be empty to start with. We don't have to create anything. It'll do that for us. But we just want to make sure we've got that page open and that we have it available. And so now that we've got everything going, we can run the Terraform init and validate that everything's right, and then it's going to initiate everything, right? So if we do a Terraform init, it's going to go out, and so in this case, right, it says it can't read B to the RI for the organization, right? So it says it's not authorized because remember we didn't do the login part, right, that we have to do for Terraform. So we need to follow these instructions real quick, like I mentioned before. You can do it ahead of time. You can do it right after you get everything set up. It doesn't matter because it's going to set a file locally in your CLI, like in your VM, basically to auto authenticate, basically. So we're just going to run that real quick. So we're going to do the Terraform login. We're going to hit yes. It's going to open up a page. This is, once again, one of those things you don't typically want to share with anyone, so I'm just going to call it Linode video demo, right? We create the token. We don't really need to copy this because it's going to do it for us, but we can copy it in case we need it. Oh, sorry, we do have to copy it. We have to copy it, and then over here we paste it in. Sorry, I forgot about that. It's then going to take that, set everything correctly for us locally, and then we're good to go. So now if I go back to my workspace, now we can run Terraform init, right? And you can see now it actually was able to log into Terraform Cloud, and it's pulling all of the modules and everything that we need. The providers basically is what they're called to do the next steps. And so now we're good to go, right? We've set all our variables. We ran the Terraform init. Now we want to plan this and see what it's going to build out for us, right? So we're going to run this Terraform Plan command. And the cool thing about this too is once this all gets done and once we do the first apply and everything, you'll start to see some of these pop up in the workspace here, right? So now you can see that it created that workspace name, and so this is coming from the main Terraform, which we're going to go through real quick before we apply this. But what this is doing is it's setting up Terraform as a whole, right? It's one big kind of section here at the top. We're telling it that we want to use the cloud, the Terraform cloud. So this is that organization thing that you put in earlier and how it set that up, and that's why we had the error when we weren't logged in and we tried to do the Terraform init, because it tries to set up and creates the state on the init and it couldn't log in and set that up, right? So it's going to error out. This is where that workspace name is coming into play. You can name this whatever you want to name it, but that's how it's identifying this name here that we're seeing. These are just some providers that are required for everything to work. There's a local file type thing being set up, and then, Linode is required as well because we're using that. Before, like I mentioned, we had that variables file with the different variables that we're using, and for each of those we have them, we're specifying them in here, right? So Linode, like I mentioned, needs that token, so we're doing var.token to bring that in. The cluster is being built here, and so this is a resource set up in Kubernetes, or sorry, in Terraform. You can go and look for this, right? So if you do a Terraform provider and do something like this, you can find it pretty quickly, right? But it's a provider Linode, and they have a documentation, so you can see Linode LKE cluster, and it basically kind of gives you, all of the information you need to supply, right? And how that works. So based off of that, we knew to put in that it needed a label, so that's where that var label comes in, Kubernetes version, right, the region, and then any tags. By default right now we're just doing a tag of prod. This could be demo, it doesn't matter. You can put this as whatever you want it to be. It's just a way for you to easily kind of visualize your resources and know what they're being used for, right? So, and then the last thing is the pool. So this is a dynamic option with Terraform. You can actually loop through things basically, and so what it's doing is it's saying for each variable that it's in pool, in this case I only have one, right, because it's just a list of one right now, it goes out and sets up a pool and everything correctly, right, with that. So that's kind of what this is. It's just basically going out, and if I ever want to add another pool or whatever, I can basically add that, add a comma here, add another pool object like what's already there, and I could have more than one pool basically, right? So that's what that's being used for. And then the last piece is here. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. Helm is another thing that you'll want to go ahead and have installed. It mentions it at the end of this, section before the next section when we start Cert Manager. But basically what it's doing is it's going out and using Helm to do some stuff and more or less install the NGINX Ingress at the end of this. And so by doing that, we need to provide and tell Helm how to connect to Kubernetes. And so what we're doing here, the host token and cluster certificate, when Linode is done, because we told it that we wanted an output of kubeconfig, it actually generates the kubeconfig in a base64 format. And so this is us decoding the YAML first, then base decoding the vars inside of that kubeconfig, and then out of that we're grabbing the cluster server, the user token, and then the cluster certificate authority basically, right? So we're basically telling Kubernetes, or telling Helm how to connect to Kubernetes, and then we're doing the same thing here for the Kubernetes provider because we're creating a namespace below that, right? So what this is basically going to do is it's going to create the Kubernetes cluster. Then when that's done, it's going to take the information from the output and then learn how to connect to the Kubernetes cluster and create our namespace automatically for us here called Cert Manager. And then it's also going to install the NGINX Ingress controller, which is therefore going to basically create a node balancer in Linode, right? So that's kind of how all of this is playing together and how all of it's working. And then now if we look at the Terraform plan, it's basically telling us the same thing of like, hey, this is everything I'm going to do, right? I'm going to create these resources. I'm going to create a Helm NGINX, Ingress. I'm going to create a namespace called Cert Manager, right? I'm going to create the cluster. I'm going to create the pool and everything, and then I'm going to create a kubeconfig setup that's being used. And then it kind of tells you the outputs, right, of what it's going to give, right? And so now if that all is successful and works, then we can run the Terraform Apply. And you'll also see, if you look here, right, this was that last config. It'll update anything or whatever here, but in a minute, under run, you'll see that it's got the plan, the one that's applying. This was the previous plan that we ran, so you can see that information as well, but now you can see the current one, right? So, and you can see right here, right, it's running the plan. And the cool thing is when this thing is done and starts asking us if we want to actually apply it, you can say yes here typically, but you could also from here confirm it and apply it to from the UI. But we're just going to get yes here. You can see now that it's like, oh, there's an apply queued, right? And then now you can see what's happening. So if you were working in like a multi-user environment, and you have multiple people doing the Terraform login and getting their own tokens, now you'd actually know like who confirmed it to you, right? So in this case, it knows I confirmed it because I'm the only user, and I hit yes from the CLI, right? So this is going to run and take a few minutes. This could take up to 10-15 minutes depending on resources at the time and how busy things are. So we're going to pause here for a few minutes, and we'll come back when this command is done and the output's finished. So now you can see we've got our output right from the Terraform Apply. It said that the apply was complete. It gives us some output information, right? And if you look, over here, everything's still kind of the same, right? So if we kind of go back to the instructions, now we need to be able to connect to the Kubernetes cluster somehow, right? Like, how do we do that? Well, we can securely kind of do this a couple of ways. The easiest way that I've built for this tutorial is you can just run this command here. And so what this basically is doing, kind of before, we're exporting a variable called kube_var, and we're setting that variable to the output of Terraform output kubeconfig, which is going to give us this big long base64 encrypted variable kind of thing. And then we're echoing that to a temporary var and base encoding it to decrypt it. And we're setting that to a config file, right? And then what ends up happening is we end up exporting kubeconfig and telling it, hey, use that file, and the PWD is saying like, the full path basically, right, to this location. And that way, no matter where we're at in our CLI, we can start running kubectl commands and we can connect to the cluster, right? So if we run the first command, it's not going to really show anything per se. But you're going to see now we have this, and I'm going to show you this. This is not something that you would also want to give anyone or share with anyone, because I'm going to delete all of this after the fact. I'm just showing you what this actually looks like. In future videos or on your own, I would also recommend looking into role-based authentication and RBAC and things of that nature with Kubernetes, so you can control permissions and multiple things. But in this case, you can see it's got the cluster here with the certificate information, the server, and the name. And then you can see here there's an admin user, and it's got its own little token. And then this is the context that tells it the default namespace and how to connect and everything, right? So after we did that, now we just have to tell kubeconfig for the kubectl, like, hey, use this configuration, right? So that's what this export command here comes into play. So now if we do that, now basically we can run, like it has here, kubectl cluster info. And if we did everything correctly, we should see, right, that it's running here, and we should see some information. And if we do like kubectl get pods, right, we should see some information from that, right? Just like this mentions, we need to also get the node balancer public IP address that it's set up during this time, because we're going to need that for the next step when we do the DNS configuration. So we can run this command here, and what this is basically saying is like, hey, in the default namespace, I need you to get a service with it gives us more information in a wider format of call of Ingress NGINX controller, and boom, right now we can see this external IP address. So we're going to want to copy that. If we follow the instructions in the DNS section, it's going to tell us what we want that to be, but I'm just going to go ahead and do that now, because I know it's going to be tf var node balancer IP, and we're going to change that right to this, and we'll set that again in a few minutes. But just like this mentions though, now we need to go to the DNS section in the directory here. So we're going to go to the DNS directory and go to next. And before we get to that, you'll notice now under Kubernetes, right, I have the B to the ride demo, and I can see all of my information here, right? So everything kind of worked the way that it wanted to. So the next part is, though, we need to set up the domain stuff so that we see our new domain in here, right, too. So that's what we're doing next. So thanks for watching the part one of this video series. Hopefully by this point you know a little bit more about Terraform and Kubernetes at a basic understanding. and you've got your Kubernetes cluster set up. In the next part, we're going to actually set up the Linode DNS and domain configuration, get cert manager configured, so that we can do SSL certs via Let's Encrypt, and then set up the Rasa chatbot publicly and expose it through SSL. So stay tuned and go ahead and watch part 2, and thanks. Have a good day.